I know you. Dahlia. Every breath. Every step. You don't know me at all. I know you take your tea with honey. Everything good in your life. I put it there. The double doors of the private conference room crashed shut behind them, the impact rattling the crystal tumblers on the sideboard until one toppled and rolled off the edge, shattering against the marble floor. He backed her into the wall of dark walnut paneling, his palm flattening against her jaw, tilting her face up to his. "I have let you breathe," he said, his voice low and lethal. "I have let you walk this city like it isn't mine. But you do not smile at another man like that again." Dahlia Marsh had never been the kind of woman who disappeared into the polished, glass-walled world of Castellano Maritime Group on the 51st floor of the Meridian Tower, where the hallways were lined with willow-thin receptionists in bodycon dresses and executives whose suits cost more than her rent. Dahlia occupied space, and she occupied it unapologetically. She was a big woman, all soft weight and generous curves, carrying every one of her 265 pounds like it belonged to her, even on the days she didn't quite believe that herself. For most of her 29 years, the world had decided that her size made her someone to look past, to be kind to underestimate, or to cast permanently in the role of the invisible, endlessly capable assistant who kept everyone else's life running. She dressed the way women like her were taught to dress: deep emerald trousers with enough drape to skim rather than cling, cream silk blouses buttoned to the collarbone, low block heels that wouldn't make her tower over anyone. She had spent a decade perfecting the art of taking up as little visual room as possible while doing the most work of anyone on the floor. But to Draven Castellano, her disappearing act had never once worked. Draven was the president of Castellano Maritime Group. Though anyone who had spent more than a month around the Boston waterfront knew that title was little more than a courtesy, Draven controlled the freight corridors running from the seaport docks up through Chelsea Creek. The man who had quietly folded the last splintered remains of two dying crime families, the Falcons, and what was left of old Marchetti territory, into a single, disciplined operation over the better part of a decade. He was a man built of terrible stillness, sharp Mediterranean features, and suits cut so precisely they looked like architecture. The city knew him as a reclusive shipping magnate who occasionally surfaced at charity galas with a different willowy socialite on his arm. Dahlia knew him as the man who required her presence 10 hours a day, every day, and gave almost nothing of himself in return. She was his executive assistant, his gatekeeper, and, though she did not know it yet, his singular obsession. Dahlia had convinced herself she was invisible to him as a woman specifically. She told herself he kept her on because she never scrambled his calendar, never breathed a word about the men with rough Southie accents who came through for late meetings that weren't in any system. And because she always remembered, he took his cortado with exactly 2 sugar cubes. Never 1, never 3. She believed her body made her safe, shielded from whatever cold, assessing gaze he turned on the rest of the world. She had no idea that he had fired his previous 2 assistants within a week of hiring them, for the single crime of not being her. She had no idea that when her name first crossed his desk, he'd had his most trusted man run a full background sweep on her, that he had quietly purchased the small triple-decker in Somerville, where she rented her 3rd-floor walk-up, just so he could install 2 armed men in the foyer under the cover story of a new property management company, her closest work friend, a sharp-tongued paralegal named Priya, who sat 2 desks down from legal, had told her more than once that she was reading the situation wrong. Nobody makes sure a woman's ex gets run out of a whole industry because they're indifferent to her. Dahlia. Priya said one Friday, over reheated dumplings in the break room. That man watches you. Like you're the only moving object in the building. He watches everyone like that. Dahlia had answered, waving it off. The way she waved off most things that felt too dangerous to hope for. She had learned that lesson early. At 24, when Corey 2 years of her life, a shared lease. A ring she'd let herself imagine, once or twice had stood in their kitchen and told her, almost gently, like it was a kindness, that he'd always figured he'd end up with someone smaller, that he'd tried to convince himself her size didn't matter, and it turned out it did. Actually, quite a lot. And he was sorry. But he needed to be honest with himself before they wasted any more of each other's time. She had packed her own boxes while he watched television in the next room. She had promised herself, packing tape between her teeth, that she would never again let a man's opinion of her body decide how much space she was allowed to take up in her own life. Then she had spent 5 years keeping that promise by needing no one, wanting nothing visibly from anyone, making herself so useful and so quiet that nobody could get close enough to disappoint her again. Priya didn't know any of that history. She only knew what she saw. And what she saw made her raise an eyebrow every time Draven Castellano's voice came through the intercom, asking for Dahlia by name, instead of buzzing the general line the way he did for everyone else. It was a bright, unseasonably warm Wednesday in late September, when the careful architecture of her invisibility came down around her ears. The office was 3 days into what should have been a routine external audit. A team from Whitfield and Cross had been picking through the sanitized ledgers for 5 days already, and Dahlia had spent most of that week fielding their requests, printing binders, and pretending not to notice how often the lead auditor found a reason to stand near her desk. His name, as far as she knew, was Nathan Cole, sandy-haired, easy smiling, disarmingly warm in a building full of people who measured every word. Nathan didn't look at Dahlia with the polite, dismissive pity she'd learned to expect from good-looking men. He lingered. He asked real questions. That particular morning, he perched on the corner of her desk holding a sage-green box tied with twine. The logo of Le Petit Con stamped discreetly on the lid. You're the only reason this whole floor hasn't collapsed into chaos. You know, that he said. Setting the box down in front of her, Dahlia felt heat climb into her cheeks. I just keep the calendar straight. Mr. Cole. Nathan. Please. He flipped the lid open to reveal 3 perfect brown butter madeleines, their edges caramelized and glossy. And that's not remotely true. This is a bribe for putting up with all of us this week. She stared at the box. She wasn't used to being given things. She wasn't used to a man with easy blue eyes noticing the perfume she wore, let alone bringing her something warm from a bakery 3 blocks away, because he'd noticed she skipped breakfast. Something loosened in her chest, small and sweet and unguarded. She looked up at him and smiled. Really smiled. The kind that crinkled the corners of her eyes and briefly wiped the careful neutrality off her whole face. That's incredibly kind of you. Nathan, thank you. 45 feet away, behind the soundproofed glass of the corner office. The temperature dropped to somewhere below freezing. Draven Castellano stood at his desk, a heavy glass paperweight resting under 2 fingers. He had been watching her all morning. The way he watched her every morning, he knew the precise minute she arrived. knew the unhurried roll of her hips when she crossed to the filing room, knew the exact shade of burnt orange lipstick she wore on days she felt brave. When he saw Nathan lean over her desk, his jaw went tight. When he saw her smile, that open, radiant, completely unguarded smile, she had never once turned on him. Something violent and white-hot moved through his blood. The paperweight cracked cleanly in his hand, a thin line of blood welling along his palm. He did not care about the audit. He did not care, in that moment, about maintaining even the thinnest veneer of legitimacy. He watched Nathan laugh at something she said, watched Nathan's hand rest on the edge of her desk. Far too close to hers, Draven pressed the intercom. His voice, when it reached her desk, was quiet in a way that was somehow louder than shouting. "Dahlia, my office." "No." She flinched, the smile dropping off her face like it had never existed. The chill in his voice went straight down her spine. "Duty calls," she murmured to Nathan, already rising, smoothing her trousers. "Good luck," he said, stepping back as though he, too. I could feel the sudden drop in air pressure coming from the corner office. Dahlia pushed through the heavy glass door into Draven's domain. The room smelled of leather, cedar, and the electric charge of a storm that hadn't broken yet. Draven stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the harbor, and did not turn around right away. "Close the blinds," he said. "Lock the door." Her heart gave one hard, heavy thump. "Mr. Castellano, is there a problem with the audit?" "Do it." Hands shaking slightly, she pressed the wall panel. The motorized shade slid down, cutting off the bullpen beyond. She turned the deadbolt herself. The privacy made the enormous office feel suddenly dangerously small. He turned then. His eyes were feral, stripped entirely of the composed mask he wore for the rest of the world. He crossed the room toward her with the slow, unhurried gait of something that had already decided the outcome. She stepped back until her spine met the door. "What were you and the auditor discussing?" he asked, stopping inches from her, close enough that she could feel the heat rolling off him. He just brought me a pastry, Mr. Castellano, to say thank you for pulling the files." She was stammering, thoroughly unsteadied by the raw intensity coming off him in waves. "Nathan." He said the name like it tasted foul. "You smiled at him." She blinked. I was just being polite." "You don't smile at me like that." His voice dropped to something graveled and possessive. He lifted the hand still faintly stained with blood and set it firm against the soft curve of her waist. She gasped. No one touched her that way. Men who looked like Draven Castellano did not touch women who looked like her with anything close to reverence. "Mr. Castellano, you can't. My name is Draven." His thumb pressed into her side, feeling the give of her body through silk. "And I have spent 3 years watching you, Dahlia. 3 years, making sure nothing in this city could touch you. 3 years, making sure the garbage you dated Corey lost his position at the firm after the things he said about your body on his way out the door. You think his sudden transfer to Denver was a coincidence?" Her breath caught, eyes going wide with a fresh, cold shock. "What? How could you possibly know about Corey?" "Because you belong to me." He leaned down until his mouth hovered a breath from her ear. "You think you're invisible. You think because you carry more of yourself than the women in this building are supposed to, that men don't look at you. You have no idea what you do to me. You are soft and warm, and the only honest thing in a building full of liars. I would burn this entire waterfront down before I let anyone disrespect you." He pulled back just far enough to hold her frightened gaze. "And then I watched you glow for a parasite in a rented suit. He was just being nice," she pleaded. Tears, stinging. Her whole understanding of the last 3 years tilting sideways beneath her. He wasn't being nice. Dahlia. His other hand came up to cradle her jaw, holding her steady. Nathan Cole isn't an auditor. His real name is Nathan Russo. He's the nephew of a man I am currently taking apart piece by piece in Dorchester. He's a rat, and he is using whatever softness he can find in you to get near my private ledgers." The blood drained from her face. "No, that can't. In my world, nothing is a coincidence." His grip on her jaw eased, thumb stroking her cheekbone, almost gently now. "I let him in because I wanted to know exactly how much the Russos knew. I had it managed. What I did not plan for was him touching your desk. I did not plan for him making you smile." He stepped closer still, his hard frame pressing her fully against the door, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "I have let you breathe. I have let you walk this city like it isn't mine," he whispered, voice trembling with something dark and furious and entirely too honest. "But you do not smile at another man again, especially not a dead man." Dahlia trembled. She had spent her whole life trying to make herself smaller, trying to hide the body she'd been taught to be ashamed of. And now she was pinned in near darkness by a man who apparently worshipped the very flesh she had spent years apologizing for. A man willing to kill because another man had made her smile, and God help her when his mouth crashed down over hers. She did not want to run. The kiss was a collision of two entirely different worlds. She had expected a man like Draven Castellano to kiss the way he did everything else, cold, precise, controlled. Instead, his mouth was consuming, starving. Nothing like the careful, disappointing kisses of her past. His hands anchored her wide hips and lifted her slightly onto her toes. Her softness pressed flush to the hard, unmovable wall of his chest. For the first time in 29 years, her sighs didn't feel like an apology. Held that firmly, that deliberately. It felt like power. She tasted espresso and dark sugar, and underneath it, something that could only be described as danger. When he finally tore his mouth from hers, his chest was heaving. He rested his forehead against hers, eyes blazing. "You're shaking," he murmured, thumb dragging over her kiss-swollen lip. "You're a mob boss." She breathed. "The stories, they're actually true. I am whatever this city needs me to be to keep it standing," he said, "and to keep you breathing." His hand slid to grip her upper arms. "Get your coat. You are not going back to your desk today. You are not setting foot in this building again until Nathan Russo's blood has dried on the pavement." Draven. "Wait, you can't just kill an auditor in the middle of downtown Boston." Reality crashed back over her. Whitfield and Cross know he's here. If he disappears, someone will ask. Whitfield and Cross know nothing. He cut in, voice returning to its terrible, level calm. "The real Nathan Cole is currently in a medically induced coma in a private clinic outside Geneva, courtesy of the Russo family. The man who brought you pastries is a ghost wearing a dead man's name. In about 4 hours, he's going to be a corpse, He didn't give her time to absorb the horror of that. He took her hand, grip, unyielding, and pulled her toward the private elevator reserved for him alone. Within minutes, they were in the underground garage, folded into the bulletproof interior of an armored black Cadillac Escalade. A team of large men in tactical gear, hired through a private contractor called Praetorian Risk Solutions, men who did not ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of the money they were paid with, flanked the vehicle as it pulled out. As the Escalade merged onto the expressway, Dahlia sat rigid against the leather seat, staring down at her own thick thighs, pressed against the center console. Then, across at Draven, who was already speaking low and fast into a burner phone in rapid Italian. He looked carved from something ancient and dangerous. What could he possibly want with her? Why her? Of all the women in that building, why didn't you just tell me any of this? She asked softly. Once he'd ended the call, his gaze softened, just slightly, as it moved over her face. Because I wanted to keep you clean. My world is filth. Dahlia. All the way down. You were the one clean thing in it. You came to work in those flowing silk shirts that drove me half out of my mind. And you kept my entire life organized, without ever asking for anything. I knew if I touched you, I'd drag you into the dark with me. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed inside her tote. The screen showed an unlisted, encrypted number. Draven's eyes snapped to it. Answer it. Speaker. Hands shaking. She swiped to accept. Hello. Dahlia. Sweetheart. The voice was Nathan's, but every trace of warmth had been stripped out of it, replaced by something flat and cold, with a hard Dorchester edge underneath. Looks like Loverboy scooped you right up. Didn't peg you for moving that fast. Big girl. But hey, good for you. Heat flooded her face. Humiliation and fury tangled together. Draven's hand closed over her thigh instantly. Steady. His thumb stroking in slow reassurance, even as his jaw hardened to stone. What do you want? Russo. His voice filled the small cabin like a verdict. Nathan laughed. Dry and humorless. I want my family's piece of the Chelsea Creek corridor back. Castellano. And I think Dahlia here is going to help me get it. See, while I was busy dropping off Madeline's, I wasn't just being charming. I slipped a mirrored drive into her terminal, used her login credentials, the ones you handed her because you're a lovesick idiot, to authorize a transfer out of your offshore holdings into a blind trust. Dahlia clapped a hand over her mouth. No, I never authorized anything. Draven. I swear to you, I know. Tesoro. His voice gentled instantly for her, then snapped back to razor wire for the man on the phone. You're a dead man. Russo. If you think moving digital currency around is going to save you, it's not the money that's going to save me. Nathan cut in. It's the paper trail. I already forwarded the transaction logs to your own capos, Enzo. Vincent. Right now it looks like your sweet fat little assistant has been quietly draining the Castellano accounts for the better part of 9 months. Your own men are going to want her head on a spike. You've got until 2 a.m. to hand over the Chelsea Creek docks. Or your own lieutenants put a bullet in her before you even get the chance to explain. The line went dead. Panic seized Dahlia's chest. Absolute and blinding. She couldn't get a full breath. The plush interior of the car suddenly felt like a coffin. She had spent her entire life trying to be invisible. And now, In the space of a single morning, she had become the flashpoint of a mob war. Draven. She choked out, tears finally spilling. They're going to kill me. Your own men are going to think I betrayed you. He pulled her bodily across the seat and onto his lap, unbothered by her weight, unbothered by anything except the terror in her voice. He wrapped both arms fully around her, burying his face against her neck. Listen to me. He growled against her skin. I am the head of this family. Not Enzo. Not Vincent. And certainly not Nathan Russo. You are safer at this exact moment than any woman in this city. But I need you to be brave for me. Can you do that? She swallowed hard, feeling the pounding of his heart against her chest. She had hidden behind her own body for years, letting the world walk past her. Over here. Around her. But looking into the eyes of a man willing to go to war with his own organization to protect her, something long dormant and fierce stirred awake. She wiped her face and nodded. Tell me what to do. He didn't take her to some rundown safe house. He took her to the private residences atop the Osprey Tower. 62 stories of glass rising over the harbor. His penthouse claiming the entire top floor, a fortress of marble, dark wood, and armed men stationed at every elevator bank. The moment the doors sealed behind them, his second in command, a scared, broad-shouldered man named Enzo, stepped forward, eyes cutting toward Dahlia with open suspicion. Boss, Enzo said, voice tight. The ledgers are moving. Every trail leads back to her terminal. Draven didn't so much as blink. He shrugged out of his suit jacket, his presence expanding to fill the massive room. If you ever look at her like that again, Enzo, I will personally put you through that window. The Russos framed her. Get the tech team on a secure line. Now, for the next 4 hours, the penthouse became a war room. Draven's hackers hunched over keyboards, sweat beading at their temples, chasing the ghost accounts Nathan had used to siphon the funds, hitting dead end after dead end as the trail bounced through proxy servers scattered across half of Eastern Europe. Dahlia sat on the edge of a velvet sofa, feeling entirely useless, watching Draven pace, watching the muscle jump in his jaw. If they couldn't recover the money before 2, he would have to hand over the docks to save her a public admission of weakness that would eventually get him killed by a rival family circling for exactly that kind of opening. She couldn't let that happen to him, she thought. Absurdly. Of every performance review she'd ever received, every one of them praising her for the same tired list of virtues organized: dependable, unflappable, under pressure. The kind of woman managers wrote glowing paragraphs about, and then forgot the second she left the room. She thought of every holiday party where she'd stood at the edge of the crowd holding a plate she wasn't eating from, watching thinner women get pulled into the center of conversations she'd never once been invited to join. She thought of Corey's voice, gentle and final, telling her that her body was the reason he couldn't stay. For years she had believed, on some level, she'd never said out loud, that a woman built like her didn't get to be the reason a man burned his own life down. She was starting, watching Draven pace that marble floor with murder in his eyes on her behalf, to understand that she had believed a lie for a very long time. She thought, too, of the version of herself who would have simply frozen at that terminal, Who would have let the men in that room decide her fate while she stood off to the side, apologizing for taking up space in a crisis? That version of her was gone. She could feel it. The way you feel a bone knit back together, slow and permanent, and impossible to undo. She stood, her thighs brushing together, and crossed to the terminal where a sweating tech was cursing under his breath. "Move," she said. He glanced at Draven, who nodded once. "Do whatever she says." Dahlia dropped into the oversized chair. She wasn't a hacker, but she was the woman who had run every piece of the company's logistics, scheduling, and digital filing for 2 years. She knew its architecture better than the men who'd built it. He didn't breach anything from outside. She muttered, fingers already flying. He said, "Mirrored drive. That means he was physically at my desk. The root access has to be tied to the local network, not an outside IP." She pulled up a hidden backdoor directory she'd built months earlier to streamline offshore invoicing for the very audit that had brought Nathan into the building in the first place. He routed it through a shell company. He used a standard Swift protocol to make it look legitimate to the auditors. I recognized the routing prefix. I set half of this system up myself. Draven moved behind her, resting both hands heavily on her shoulders. "Can you trace where it landed? Give me 30 seconds. She cross-referenced the routing numbers against the shipping manifests she still knew by heart. Got it. He didn't just hide the money. He used it to buy a shipment of illegal weapons from a Serbian broker. It's not cash anymore. Draven. It's hardware. Enzo swore loudly. "Where's the shipment?" Dahlia hit enter, pulling up a live satellite feed. "Boston Harbor. Pier 9. It docked 35 minutes ago. Russo's there right now, taking delivery with your money." Silence dropped over the room. Draven stared at the screen, then down at the woman sitting in front of it, the woman the world had told to be quiet, to be embarrassed of her own body, to stay in the background where she wouldn't be seen. She had just outmaneuvered one of the most dangerous men on the East Coast. Without leaving her chair, he bent and pressed a hard, reverent kiss to her temple. "You are extraordinary." Then he turned to Enzo, and every trace of softness left his face. "Call the strike teams. We're going to the harbor. No one walks off Pier 9 tonight. Bring me Russo alive. I want to look him in the eyes." The following 4 hours were an agony of waiting for Dahlia. She paced the marble floor of the penthouse, heart lodged somewhere in her throat, imagining Draven bleeding out on a loading dock, imagining him dying because he'd chosen a fat assistant over his entire empire just after 1 in the morning. The heavy doors finally opened. Draven stood in the frame. His suit was ruined. Dark stains soaked through the fabric. His knuckles split and swollen. He smelled of salt water, gun smoke, and copper, but he was alive. He walked past his men without a word, dismissed them with a flick of his wrist, and locked the door behind them. The second the bolt clicked, the terrifying head of the Castellano family disappeared, and he sank to his knees in front of her, wrapping both arms around her waist and pressing his blood-stained face into the soft curve of her stomach. "It's done. Erospt. The money's recovered. The shipment is ours. The Russo operation is finished." Dahlia dropped to her knees in front of him, ignoring the blood soaking into her blouse, and cradled his face between her hands. "Are you hurt?" "Only when I couldn't see you." He looked up at her with an adoration so complete it stole the breath from her lungs. Slowly, He rose. Pulling her up with him, he didn't lead her to the sofa. He walked her backward until the backs of her knees hit the enormous bed in the master suite. I've spent 3 years imagining what you look like, without all of this fabric hiding you, he said, voice dropping as his fingers worked the buttons of her blouse loose. 3 years wanting to worship every inch of you. Her old insecurities flared, sharp and sudden. Draven. I'm not built like the women you usually. I'm big. I take up a lot of room. He stripped off his ruined shirt, revealing a chest built of hard muscle and old, faded scars, and stepped fully into her space, his palms sliding beneath her shirt to cover the soft roll of her waist completely. I don't want angles, Dahlia. I want you. His eyes burned, dark and hungry. I want your softness. I want your weight in my hands. I want a woman with enough presence to stand beside me and hold this whole world together. You are not something to apologize for. You are a queen. And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. He eased the silk from her shoulders, his gaze sweeping over every inch. She'd spent a lifetime hiding no mockery in his eyes. No polite tolerance. Only pure, unhurried reverence. When he kissed her again, it wasn't a claim. It was a vow. He laid her back against the sheets, letting his body cover hers, loving the way she yielded to his strength, while somehow never once losing her own entirely singular power. That night, the invisible assistant quietly died, and something far more dangerous took her place. The official story, of the one that ran in 2 lines of a shipping trade newsletter the following week, said only that a long-time logistics firm had settled a contract dispute with a smaller competitor and absorbed several of its accounts. No one outside a very small circle would ever know what had actually happened on Pier 9, or how close the Chelsea Creek docks had come to changing hands over the course of a single terrifying night. Dahlia never returned to her old apartment in Somerville. Her belongings arrived at the Osprey Tower 2 days later, packed by men who did not ask questions, and she told herself she'd deal with the emotional weight of that particular development some other day. When she finally came back to the office a week later, Priya met her at the elevator bank with a paper cup of coffee and a look that said she had several hundred questions, and the good sense not to ask any of them out loud in a building full of cameras. You look different, Priya said instead, studying her. I feel different, Dahlia admitted. Good, different, or terrifying different, Dahlia thought about the blood on Draven's knuckles, the way he'd knelt in front of her, like she was the only solid thing left in his world, the way he'd said you are extraordinary, like it was simply a fact and not a compliment. Both, she said, and meant it. Nathan Russo's name never appeared in any paper. Whitfield and Cross quietly reassigned the Castellano audit to a different senior associate, and never asked why the original lead had abruptly resigned to pursue other opportunities abroad. The rest of the audit team finished their work in silence, visibly relieved to be gone by the following Friday. 18 months later, Nathan Russo was a name no one dared say above a whisper, a cautionary tale traded in the dark corners of every waterfront bar from Chelsea to Southie. Castellano Maritime Group had more than doubled in size, running with a precision that unsettled every rival family paying attention. And at the exact center of that empire sat Dahlia Castellano. She no longer wore trousers designed to disguise her. She sat at the head of the boardroom table in a custom cobalt blue power suit that fit every generous curve of her like it had been built around her, because it had. She was, without dispute, the most dangerous woman on the Eastern Seaboard. Armed with a mind sharper than half the men in that room, and backed by a man who watched her every movement with unwavering, unapologetic devotion, her mother. Visiting from out of state for the first time since the wedding, a small, fierce, marble-floored affair that Draven had insisted on planning down to the last flower, because he wanted, in his words, to give her one day in her life where every single detail existed only to celebrate her, had stood in the doorway of the Meridian Tower boardroom and watched her daughter run a merger negotiation for 40 minutes without once shrinking in. Her chair. You used to apologize for pulling out your own chair at restaurants, her mother had said afterward, quietly. In the elevator. I don't think I ever heard you say sorry in there once. I'm done apologizing, Dahlia had told her, and found that she meant it completely. Enzo, who had once looked at her like a liability to be managed, now brought her coffee without being asked, and had taken, in the last year, to quietly running every major logistics decision past her before it reached Draven's desk at all, a shift in loyalty so gradual that Dahlia suspected even Enzo hadn't fully registered it happening. Vincent still called her boss's girl under his breath sometimes, when he thought no one was listening, but he'd stopped saying it to her face. After the second time, she corrected a routing error he'd missed and saved the family $400,000 in a single afternoon, and when she smiled across the table at a nervous junior executive during a merger negotiation, Draven Castellano simply leaned back in his chair, a slow, possessive smile of his own tugging at his mouth. He didn't mind her smiling at other men anymore. Everyone in that room already knew exactly who she belonged to and precisely what he was capable of if anyone dared to forget it. Later that evening, long after the junior executive had gathered his files and fled the building, looking faintly relieved to still be breathing, Draven found her alone on the terrace of the Meridian Tower, watching the lights come on across the harbor, one building at a time. He came up behind her, wrapping both arms around her waist, resting his chin against the crown of her head the way he had every evening for the better part of a year and a half. Regrets, he murmured into her hair. Only half joking, she leaned back into him, letting her full weight settle against his chest, and felt him take it easily, the way he always did. Like her weight had never once been a question worth asking. Only that it took a mob war for me to figure out I was never the one who needed to shrink. No, he agreed, pressing his mouth to her temple. You were always the one the rest of us needed to catch up to. Did Dahlia's transformation from an overlooked assistant into the most feared woman in Boston shipping leave you breathless? Draven's obsessive, protective love is a reminder that real power has never had anything to do with the size of the body carrying it. If this intense, body-positive mafia, romance, full of danger, betrayal, and undeniable passion pulled you in, I hit that like button. Share it with a friend who loves a fiercely possessive alpha hero, and subscribe for more dramatic, addictive romance stories. See you in the next one.